I'm in 0808 Lens, and we will be taking a look at the lens automation in Duik. The lens tool is a nifty little way to create custom-made lens flare motion out of any type of layer. Normally when you create a lens flare in After Effects, you're stuck using the lens flare effect, like I'm using here on this lens flare adjustment layer. Yes, it's cool, but what if you're creating all your animation as an old school cutout paper Saul Bass style homage? Well, those fancy light effects just won't do. Your animation needs to look paper made, otherwise it's gonna clash. Thanks to this automation, I can animate these paper lens flare layers that I've created to animate and move in a similar way as this lens flare effect. I'm gonna pause playback by hitting the spacebar and turn off the eyeball on my lens flare effect layer. I'll close that up, and briefly I want to show you these different layers. I have my Flare 1, which is that round circle at the top. I have Flare 2, which is that circle there. Flare 3, Flare 4 is that little dot there, and the back layer, Flare 5, is that huge light source there. Now, all of these layers are lined up and have their anchor point in the center, and for the most part, their anchor points are lined up very close together. So the first thing I need to do to create this effect is create a control layer. So I'm actually going to leave the automation menu and go back to my rigging menu, which looks like this little guy icon here. I'm going to go down to the controllers, and I want to make sure my controller is big. Yes, a big size controller, and let's make it green so it stands out from this background a little bit. Other than that, I'll make sure I have all of these check marked, and that looks good. So before I create this controller, I want to deselect any layer I have selected so it creates it fresh, and then I will click Create. Right off the bat, it gives us a new C_guide layer, which means it won't show up when we render it out, thanks to this little icon here. And I'm going to rename this by selecting it and hitting Return, C_lens. I'm going to go ahead and move this and line it up with the center of these. And now I'm going to move this down just above my flare layers. So the selection order matters on this. So I'm going to start by selecting my C lens control. I'm going to hold down Command, select Flare 1, Flare 2, Flare 3, Flare 4, and Flare 5 back. Now I'm going to go back into my automation menu by clicking this icon up here. I'll go down to my Lens button and click on that. Everything's been shifted off center a little bit, but if we go up and we grab onto our flare control and move it around, you can see that all these paper layers are connected and moving based on this control layer and moving much like you would see a lens flare move. It looks fantastic. I'm loving this. So let's take a quick look at some of the effects that are on these layers. With the control layer selected, I'm just going to hit E on my keypad to bring up the lens flare effect it created, double click on it, and you can see we have intensity and scale as two options on our control. The intensity will control the opacity for every single layer. So I can put it down to something like 50%, and every layer will be affected. The scale will scale up or down all of our layers proportionately. I'll keep that at 100. Now let's look at our individual layers. Flare 1 through Flare 4 all have the same effect on it, which is lens flare distance. So the distance for Flare 1 is at 20%, Flare 2 is at 40%, Flare 3, 60, Flare 4, 80, and Flare 5, 100. This is kind of like Z-scale if we were using 3D effects, but we're not, so it's just simulated distance from each other. We could change this up by going to something like Flare 1, and instead of being 20%, we could make this at negative 148%. And when we move it, you'll notice this come past really fast, as if it's much closer to us in Z space. I'm going to put that back to 20% by selecting it and making it 20. Now I'm going to go back up to my control layer, and I'll bring the intensity back up to 100 for everything, just so I can look at it all bright and proper and good. So why settle for the limited lens flare options After Effects gives you when a world of custom-made creative lens flares are practically beckoning you thanks to Duik?